December 16, 1944 marked the beginning of what would become Adolf Hitler's last, desperate gamble in the West. And for the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, it represented the start of an operation that would transform Germany's most celebrated armored unit into a shattered remnant within 9 catastrophic days. The division, bearing the Führer's own name and carrying the weight of Nazi Germany's military prestige, rolled through the fog-shrouded Ardennes forest with 22,000 men, over 100 tanks, and an arrogance born from years of brutal victories across Europe. The Leibstandarte, as it was commonly known, was not merely another military formation. It had evolved from Hitler's personal bodyguard into an elite, Waffen-SS division that had fought with savage effectiveness from Poland to France. From Greece to the Eastern Front, its commander, Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Monk, a hardened veteran with a reputation for ruthlessness, led men who wore their death's head insignia with pride and viewed themselves as the racial and military elite of the Third Reich. These were not conscripts or ordinary soldiers. They were ideological warriors who had sworn personal oaths to Hitler and had proven their fanaticism in countless battles. As the division's columns moved westward on that frozen December morning, their mission seemed straightforward: punch through American lines in Belgium, race to the Meuse River, and ultimately reach Antwerp, thereby splitting the Allied forces and potentially changing the course of the war. Hitler had personally selected the Leibstandarte to spearhead this audacious offensive, known as Operation Watch on the Rhine, placing his faith in the division that bore his name to deliver the decisive blow that would vindicate his strategic genius. The initial hours of the attack went according to plan. American positions, thinly held by inexperienced units resting after the brutal autumn campaigns, crumbled under the weight of German artillery and armor. Villages fell in rapid succession. Honsfeld, Bullingen, and Ligneville became names on a map of conquest as Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead battle group led by the charismatic and merciless Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, drove deep into American territory. Peiper, just 29 years old, commanded over 4,000 men and a column of tanks that stretched for 15 miles along narrow Belgian roads. According to military historian Antony Beever's detailed account in Ardennes 1944, the Leibstandarte entered the battle with not just military objectives, but with a mindset shaped by years of Eastern Front brutality, where civilian massacres and prisoner executions had become routine. This mentality would soon manifest itself in ways that would forever stain the division's record and galvanize American resistance in unexpected ways. The soldiers of the Leibstandarte believed themselves invincible. They had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, where entire Soviet armies had been encircled and destroyed. They had seen their Tiger and Panther tanks dominate battlefields from Kursk to Normandy. As they advanced through Belgium's frozen countryside, past startled civilians and fleeing American soldiers, they could not have imagined that within 9 days their division would be reduced to a broken shadow of its former strength, retreating in disarray through the same roads they now traveled with such confidence. December 17, 1944 dawned cold and gray over the Belgian crossroads at Bognes, near the village of Mamidi, and what occurred there in the early afternoon would transform the Battle of the Bulge from a conventional military engagement into something far more personal and vengeful for American forces. Kampfgruppe Peiper's lead elements, racing westward with their timetable already falling behind schedule, encountered a lightly armed American convoy from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The American soldiers, mostly young men who had been heading toward routine assignments, found themselves suddenly facing German tanks and armored vehicles. Outgunned and trapped, approximately 120 men surrendered, expecting to become prisoners of war protected under the Geneva Conventions. They were herded into a snow-covered field adjacent to the road, their hands raised, weapons discarded, posing no threat to the German advance. What happened next would echo through military history as one of the war's most notorious atrocities. SS soldiers, acting either on orders or from the ingrained brutality of their Eastern Front experience, opened fire on the unarmed prisoners with machine guns and pistols. Men fell in waves, their blood staining the white snow crimson. Some attempted to flee into nearby woods but were hunted down. Others played dead among the corpses of their comrades, lying motionless in the freezing field for hours as German soldiers walked among the bodies, firing single shots into any who showed signs of life. Of the 120 men captured, 84 were murdered in cold blood. Survivors who managed to escape through the woods carried news of the massacre to American lines, and the story spread through Allied units with the speed of wildfire. Soldiers who had previously viewed their German opponents as fellow professionals now saw them as war criminals deserving no mercy. The order went out informally but effectively: take no SS prisoners. The Malmedy Massacre, as it became known, transformed the psychological landscape of the battle and ensured that Kampfrupp-Peiper would face an enemy motivated not just by duty, but by rage and a desire for justice. Meanwhile, Peiper's column continued its advance, but the timeline Hitler had demanded was already slipping away. The narrow Belgian roads, muddy and congested, could not accommodate the rapid movement of heavy armor. Fuel supplies, always the Wehrmacht's Achilles heel, were running dangerously low. Peiper had been promised captured American fuel dumps to sustain his advance, but these proved either empty or destroyed before German forces could secure them. His tanks, the magnificent Panthers and Tigers that were technological marvels but fuel-hungry monsters, began consuming their reserves at an alarming rate. By the evening of December 17th, Kampfrupp-Peiper had reached Stavlet, a crucial town with bridges over the Amblève River. Here, the first signs of serious American resistance emerged. Though initially successful in capturing the town, Peiper found his forces increasingly hemmed in by American engineers who demolished bridges and by infantry units that, having heard of Malmedy, fought with unusual tenacity. The Americans were no longer retreating in panic. They were making the Germans pay for every meter of ground. The Leibstandarte supporting units, following behind Kampfrupp-Peiper, found their own advance stalling against stiffening resistance. American artillery, having recovered from the initial surprise, began delivering devastating fire on German columns confined to narrow roads. The weather, which had initially favored the Germans by grounding Allied aircraft, showed signs of clearing, promising the return of American air superiority that had dominated Western European skies since D-Day. December 18th through 20th, 1944 witnessed the transformation of Kampfrupp. Peiper's bold advance into an increasingly desperate situation as American forces, recovering from their initial shock, began implementing a strategy that would trap Germany's elite spearhead in a gradually constricting pocket. General Courtney Hodges, commander of the United States First Army, recognized that stopping Peiper's advance was crucial to containing the entire German offensive, and he directed forces from multiple directions to isolate and destroy the SS battle group. The American 82nd Airborne Division, veterans of parachute drops in Normandy and Operation Market Garden, arrived at the critical town of Werbemont, blocking Peiper's route to the Meuse River. These were not green troops who would panic at the sight of German tanks. They were hardened paratroopers who had fought in some of the war's most intense battles. Under the command of Brigadier General James Gavin, they established defensive positions that turned Werbemont into an impenetrable barrier. Peiper's intelligence officers brought him the grim news: the direct route west was closed. Simultaneously, American forces retook Stavlet behind Peiper, cutting his supply line and trapping the entire Kampfrupp in the narrow valley around the villages of La Gleize and Stoumont. The bridges Peiper needed for maneuver or retreat were systematically destroyed by American combat engineers who worked under fire to place demolition charges. German attempts to rebuild or secure alternative crossings were met with intense artillery fire directed by forward observers who had infiltrated the surrounding hills. The situation for the Leibstandarte's other elements was equally deteriorating. The main body of the division, attempting to follow Peiper's route or find alternative paths westward, encountered American resistance that grew stronger by the hour. The 30th Infantry Division, nicknamed Old Hickory, fought with particular determination, having also learned of the Malmedy Massacre and seeking revenge for the murdered soldiers. German after-action reports noted with surprise the ferocity of American attacks. describing enemy infantry assaults that continued despite heavy casualties. Weather conditions on December 19th briefly cleared, and the consequences for German forces were immediate and catastrophic. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings appeared over the Ardennes in numbers that stunned the Wehrmacht soldiers below. Trained in ground attack operations and equipped with bombs, rockets, and heavy machine guns, these aircraft turned the narrow roads into killing zones. German columns, unable to disperse in the confined terrain, suffered devastating losses. Tanks that had survived Russian anti-tank guns were destroyed by American rockets. Supply trucks burst into flames. The proud armored columns that had begun the offensive just days earlier were transformed into burning wrecks scattered along Belgian roads. Piper's fuel situation became critical. His Panthers and Tigers, magnificent in combat but requiring enormous amounts of gasoline, sat immobile for lack of fuel. Attempts to airdrop supplies failed when Luftwaffe transport planes were shot down or dropped their cargo into American-held territory. The Kampfgruppe, designed for rapid, offensive operations, found itself instead besieged in villages, defending against an enemy that grew stronger while German strength ebbed with each passing hour. American artillery, positioned on the surrounding heights, subjected the trapped Germans to relentless bombardment. The 105th Field Artillery Battalion alone fired thousands of rounds into La Glaise, the village where Piper had established his command post. Buildings collapsed, tanks were disabled, and casualties mounted. German soldiers, accustomed to being the attackers, now experienced the terror of being surrounded and systematically pounded by superior firepower. December 21st through 22nd, 1944 found Kampfgruppe Piper completely encircled in the small Belgian village of La Glaise, a hamlet that had become a death trap for Germany's elite soldiers, and as American forces tightened their grip, the men of the Leibstandarte faced the stark reality that their bold offensive had collapsed into a desperate fight for survival. The village, perched on hilly terrain overlooking the Amblève River Valley, offered defensive advantages, but was also a prison with no escape routes. Piper's situation could hardly have been more dire. Of the approximately 4,000 men he had commanded at the offensive's start, he now had roughly 800 combat-effective soldiers. His fuel supplies were completely exhausted, rendering his remaining armor useless except as stationary pillboxes. Ammunition was running critically low. Medical supplies were depleted, and the wounded, numbering in the hundreds, suffered in makeshift aid stations with inadequate care. Food supplies had dwindled to near nothing, and soldiers subsisted on half rations scavenged from captured American stocks. The Americans surrounding La Glaise included elements of the 30th Infantry Division, reinforced by armor and artillery, and they were in no mood to negotiate. The memory of Mameli hung over the battlefield like a toxic cloud. American commanders received authorization to use any means necessary to eliminate the trapped SS force. Artillery fire intensified, turning the village into a landscape of rubble and fire. Heavy bombers were called in, dropping tons of explosives on German positions. The psychological impact on the surrounded Germans was profound. Soldiers accustomed to dominating battlefields now cowered in cellars as the earth shook from explosions. Piper attempted to break out on December 21st, launching attacks in multiple directions to probe for weaknesses in the American encirclement. Each attempt was beaten back with heavy losses. American infantry, now confident and aggressive, fought from well-prepared positions and called down devastating artillery fire on any German concentration. German tanks, those that still had fuel, advanced only short distances before being destroyed by American tank destroyers or bazooka teams. The breakout attempts accomplished nothing except to deplete Piper's dwindling strength. Communication with higher headquarters became sporadic and then ceased entirely. Piper's radio operators, working with damaged equipment and weak batteries, could not reach division command to request orders or support. The Kampfgruppe was alone, cut off, not just physically, but also from the command structure that might have authorized a surrender or organized a relief operation. Piper faced the loneliest command decision of his career: continue fighting to the last man, as Nazi ideology demanded, or attempt to save his surviving soldiers through some other means. The remaining elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Fighting elsewhere in the Ardennes fared only slightly better. The division had been split into multiple battle groups that operated semi-independently, and each encountered fierce American resistance that prevented any coordinated advance. American reinforcements poured into the battle sector. The 1st Infantry Division, the 9th Armored Division, elements of the 3rd Armored Division, all veteran units that knew how to fight German armor. German commanders at higher levels began recognizing the offensive's failure. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander in the West, privately acknowledged that the attack had not achieved its objectives and could not succeed. Yet Hitler refused to authorize any withdrawal, insisting that the offensive continue despite mounting evidence of its futility. The Leibstandarte, Hitler's namesake division, was being sacrificed to the Führer's delusions, and its destruction would serve no strategic purpose. For the surrounded men in Le Glay's ideology and grand strategy mattered little compared to immediate survival. They huddled in basements and ruins, listening to American shells explode, watching their comrades die from wounds that proper medical care could have treated, and wondering whether they would live to see another sunrise. The elite warriors who had entered Belgium 9 days earlier with confidence and arrogance now faced the prospect of annihilation or the shame of surrender. December 23, 1944 brought Joachim Peiper to a decision that would save the lives of his remaining men but would forever mark him as having failed in his mission, and as darkness fell over the besieged village of Le Glaise, the survivors of Kampfgruppe Peiper prepared to abandon their vehicles, their wounded, and their pride in a desperate attempt to escape the American noose through the frozen forests of Belgium. Peiper had concluded that continued resistance would result only in the complete annihilation of his force without achieving any military purpose. The situation that forced this decision was unambiguous. American forces had Le Glaise completely surrounded with overwhelming strength. Artillery fire had intensified to the point where entire buildings collapsed hourly. The wounded numbered over 300 men who could not be moved. Medical supplies had run out, and men died from injuries that would have been survivable with proper treatment. Ammunition stocks had dwindled to levels that would sustain combat for only hours. Most critically, every tank, every half-track, every vehicle in the Kampfgruppe sat immobile for lack of fuel. Peiper's plan was born of desperation. Under cover of darkness, his able-bodied soldiers would abandon their equipment and wounded, then move on foot through the forested hills south of Le Glaise, hoping to infiltrate through American lines and reach German-held territory. It was a plan that violated military honor by leaving wounded comrades, and it guaranteed the loss of all the division's heavy equipment, but it offered the only chance to save any of his men. The alternative was death or surrender, and for an SS officer, surrender was theoretically not an option. Before departing, Peiper made arrangements that revealed the complexity of his character. He ordered his medical officers to remain with the wounded and formally surrendered these men to American forces, providing a list of casualties and requesting medical treatment for them. This action likely saved hundreds of lives, as American medical personnel treated the German wounded with professional care despite Mamedi. Peiper also ordered the destruction of all equipment that could not be carried, denying the Americans any usable vehicles or weapons. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on December 24th, roughly 800 German soldiers began their escape from La Glaise. They moved in single file through deep snow, carrying only personal weapons and minimal equipment, heading south into the darkness. Behind them, La Glaise burned from the final demolitions and artillery fire. The escape route took them through dense forest where navigation was difficult and the risk of encountering American patrols was constant. The trek was harrowing. Soldiers moved through waist-deep snow and sub-freezing temperatures, their breath forming clouds in the night air. Every sound potentially signaling discovery by American forces. Men suffering from wounds they had concealed collapsed and were left behind, unable to keep pace. Others simply disappeared into the darkness, separated from their units by the difficult terrain. American patrols did encounter some German groups, resulting in firefights that ended with German casualties or captures, but the main body of Peiper's force managed to slip through the gaps in American lines. After 36 hours of movement through enemy territory, approximately 770 soldiers from Kampfgruppe, Piper reached German lines near the town of Wann on Christmas Day. They arrived exhausted, frostbitten, demoralized, and stripped of all their equipment. Piper had saved most of his men's lives, but his battle group had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Behind him in La Glaise, American forces had captured over 300 wounded Germans, dozens of abandoned tanks and vehicles, and clear evidence of the Kampfgrupp's complete defeat. The remainder of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler faced similar disasters across the Ardennes battlefield during these same days. Other battle groups had also penetrated deep into American-held territory, but found themselves similarly trapped and forced to retreat with heavy losses. The division's casualties after 9 days of combat were staggering: over 5,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, and virtually all its heavy equipment destroyed or abandoned. December 24th through 25th, 1944, witnessed the complete collapse of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler's offensive power as scattered survivors straggled back to German lines bearing news of catastrophic losses that would take months to replace. And the division that had entered Belgium as Hitler's elite spearhead now existed only as a hollow shell of disorganized remnants. Christmas Day, which should have found German forces celebrating and captured Antwerp according to Hitler's plan, instead saw the Leibstandarte licking its wounds and counting its dead. The statistics of destruction told a devastating story. Of the division's original complement of 126 tanks and assault guns, fewer than 20 survived in operational condition. The remainder had been destroyed by American fire, abandoned for lack of fuel, or left behind in the retreat. The Panthers and Tigers that had represented Germany's technological superiority in armored warfare now sat as burned-out hulks along Belgian roads, or served as captured trophies for American soldiers to photograph. Artillery pieces, half-tracks, trucks, and support vehicles had similarly been lost in numbers that effectively eliminated the division's mobility and firepower. Personnel losses were equally catastrophic. While exact figures remained disputed in the chaos of retreat, divisional records indicated approximately 5,500 casualties from all causes: killed, wounded, captured, or missing. This represented nearly 1/4 of the division's effective strength lost in just 9 days of combat. More significantly, many of these losses came from the division's most experienced soldiers and junior leaders, the sergeants and lieutenants whose battlefield knowledge and leadership could not be easily replaced. The psychological impact of the defeat perhaps exceeded even the material losses. The Leibstandarte had built its reputation on victory, on the myth of SS invincibility, on the belief that ideological commitment and racial superiority guaranteed battlefield success. The Ardennes offensive had shattered these illusions. Soldiers who survived told stories not of glorious combat, but of being trapped, pounded by artillery, hunted by aircraft, and forced into humiliating retreat. The division's pride had been broken along with its combat power. American forces, meanwhile, had proven something equally important. The rapid German advance that characterized the offensive's first days had created panic in some quarters and raised questions about Allied military competence. But the containment and destruction of Kampfgruppe Piper demonstrated that American forces could recover from surprise, adapt to circumstances, and defeat Germany's best troops when properly led and supplied. The soldiers who fought at Stevlet, Stoumont, and La Glaise had earned their place among the war's most effective combat units. The broader Battle of the Bulge continued into January 1945, but for the Leibstandarte the battle effectively ended on December 24th. The division withdrew from combat to refit and reorganize, a process that would take until late January. During this period, replacements arrived to fill the depleted ranks. But these were increasingly young conscripts or transfers from other units, not the motivated volunteers who had characterized the Waffen-SS in earlier years. Equipment was slowly replaced, though fuel shortages meant that even rebuilt units could not train properly. Hitler's reaction to the offensive's failure, and specifically to the Leibstandarte's performance, revealed his growing detachment from reality. Rather than acknowledging the operational impossibilities he had created through poor planning, inadequate logistics, and underestimation of Allied strength, he blamed his commanders for lacking sufficient will and determination. The Führer was particularly incensed by Paper's abandonment of his equipment in La Gleize, viewing it as a betrayal of Nazi principles, despite the fact that continued resistance would have achieved nothing except complete annihilation of the force. The German High Command conducted after-action reviews that identified multiple factors contributing to the offensive's failure: insufficient fuel supplies, poor road networks that prevented rapid maneuver, Allied air superiority when weather cleared, stronger than expected American resistance, and the impossibility of achieving strategic surprise in modern warfare with radio intelligence and aerial reconnaissance. These lessons, however, came too late to alter Germany's trajectory toward defeat. The 9 days from December 16th through December 24th, 1944, had transformed the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler from Germany's most celebrated armored formation into a cautionary tale about the limits of tactical excellence when strategy, logistics, and overall military balance favor the enemy. And the division's destruction in Belgium represented not just a military defeat, but a symbolic ending to the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct offensive operations in the West. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, had failed decisively, and the Leibstandarte's fate illustrated why. The immediate consequences for the division were severe, but not permanent. By late January 1945, the Leibstandarte had been partially rebuilt with replacement personnel and equipment, though it never again reached its pre-Ardennes strength or combat effectiveness. In February, the division was transferred to Hungary to participate in Germany's final offensive operations around Lake Balaton, where it again suffered heavy losses against Soviet forces. By war's end in May 1945, the division that had once been Nazi Germany's showpiece had been reduced to scattered remnants attempting to surrender to Western Allied forces rather than face Soviet captivity. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties and enormous quantities of irreplaceable equipment, particularly armor and fuel that the Wehrmacht desperately needed for defensive operations. The offensive delayed the Allied advance into Germany by several weeks but achieved none of its strategic objectives. Antwerp remained in Allied hands, the Allied armies were not split, and no negotiated peace emerged. Instead, Germany had squandered resources in an offensive that hastened rather than delayed the Third Reich's final collapse. For Joachim Peiper, the Ardennes campaign marked the beginning of a long reckoning with his wartime actions. After the war, he was tried for the Mamidi massacre and other war crimes, sentenced to death, then had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment, and was eventually released in 1956 after serving 11 years. He lived quietly in France until 1976, when former French resistance members discovered his location and likely killed him in an arson attack on his home. The Mamidi massacre, the crime committed during those 9 days in Belgium, followed him literally to his death. The broader lessons of the Leibstandarte's destruction in Belgium extended beyond immediate military consequences. The battle demonstrated that by late 1944, German tactical skill and technological advantages in certain weapon systems could not overcome Allied superiority in numbers, logistics, air power, and industrial production. No amount of ideological fervor or individual soldier bravery could compensate for fundamental strategic disadvantages. The age of blitzkrieg, of rapid armored advances achieving decisive victories, had ended when facing opponents with mature military organizations and secure supply lines. American forces emerged from the Ardennes with increased confidence and clear evidence that they could defeat Germany's best troops in direct combat. The soldiers who had fought at places like La Gleize and Stavelot returned to their units with battle experience and the knowledge that SS divisions, despite their fearsome reputations, could be trapped and destroyed through combined arms coordination and determined fighting. This psychological shift contributed to the rapid Allied advances into Germany during the final months of the war. The 9-day destruction of the Leibstandarte also highlighted the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi military system. The Mamidi massacre, far from intimidating American forces into surrender or retreat, had galvanized enemy resistance and ensured that SS units would face opponents motivated by righteous anger. The division's willingness to commit atrocities reflected the complete corruption of military professionalism by Nazi ideology, and these crimes ensured that even the division's legitimate combat achievements would be forever tainted by association with war crimes. In the final analysis, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler entered Belgium in mid-December 1944 as the symbol of Nazi Germany's military might and racial ideology. 9 days later, it emerged as a broken force that illustrated the inevitable fate of a regime built on false premises, criminal methods, and strategic delusions. The division's destruction in Belgium was not merely a military defeat, but a preview of the total collapse that would engulf Nazi Germany within 5 months, when the 1,000-year Reich ended in unconditional surrender and its leaders faced judgment for their crimes against humanity.